Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we bring you a chilling and twisted tale, one of global paranoia, bio-terrorism, and a dangerous obsession. This is the story of the Feathered Plague. A tale of ambition, greed, and the horrifying consequences of human interference. This case will leave you wondering, how far would someone go to control life and death itself? And what happens when nature fights back? Stay with us as we unravel the dark and tragic story of the Feathered Plague. What if the world's deadliest flu outbreak wasn't a natural disaster, but a meticulously planned act of terror? This chilling story reveals the deadly power of human greed and how a single act of betrayal unleashed chaos on a global scale. The story begins in the quiet rural farmlands of southern Texas, where a mysterious illness wipes out a poultry farm overnight. Martha Green, a seasoned poultry farmer, wakes up to a horrifying scene. Overnight, hundreds of her chickens have died. Their lifeless bodies litter the coops, their feathers strangely discolored with an unnatural grayish hue. The farm, once bustling with clucking and activity, is eerily silent. To Martha, this isn't just another case of disease. Something feels deeply wrong. When the local authorities arrive, they dismiss the incident as a rare avian virus, suggesting she cull the surviving birds and disinfect the property. To them, it's routine, a standard protocol for farms experiencing outbreaks. But Martha remains uneasy, haunted by the suddenness and scale of the deaths. Over the following days, she begins experiencing severe flu-like symptoms. Her health deteriorates rapidly, and she is rushed to the nearest hospital, where her condition worsens alarmingly fast. Doctors are baffled by her symptoms: a high fever, uncontrollable coughing, the appearance of blood clots that seem to spread throughout her body, and organ failure. Despite their efforts, Martha succumbs within 48 hours of admission. Hers is the first recorded death, but it won't be the last. In the days following Martha's death, other cases emerge in nearby towns. Entire families fall ill after handling poultry or visiting farms. Panic begins to spread, but no one knows where the virus came from or how it spreads. What begins as a localized crisis quickly spreads. The mysterious illness doesn't just affect birds, it is jumping to humans. News of the outbreak begins to circulate, though initial reports are vague, attributing the illness to seasonal flu or poor sanitation practices. But the symptoms are unlike anything doctors have seen before, and the mortality rate is staggering. Hundreds of miles away, in a biohazard research facility in Atlanta, Dr. Evelyn Hayes, a senior virologist, is monitoring the outbreak with growing concern. For years, Evelyn has studied zoonotic diseases, viruses that spread from animals to humans. But the reports coming from Texas are unlike anything she has encountered. She notices an alarming detail. The symptoms described in these cases bear a striking resemblance to a genetically modified strain of avian influenza that her lab had been working on just months earlier. That particular strain was part of a controversial experiment aimed at understanding how viruses mutate to infect humans. Officially, the strain had been destroyed after the experiment was deemed too dangerous. Dr. Evelyn Hayes couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that the outbreak wasn't a natural occurrence. Evelyn's unease grows as she compares the outbreak's progression to the data from her lab's experiments. The similarities are undeniable. She checks internal lab records, expecting to find routine destruction logs confirming the strain's disposal after the research was deemed too risky. Instead, she finds irregularities. The strain in question had been marked as destroyed, but the logs were incomplete. Someone had tampered with the records, and the implications were chilling. As Evelyn digs deeper, she stumbled upon encrypted files buried in the lab's digital archives. They belonged to Dr. Victor Stein, a colleague known for his brilliance but also for his controversial views. He was the lead researcher on the project and had been vocal about the potential of weaponizing viruses. Victor had always believed in pushing ethical boundaries for what he called the greater good. While others dismissed his suggestions of weaponizing viruses as absurd and dangerous, he had remained unapologetic about his stance. While his ideas were dismissed as ethically unacceptable, he had always maintained an air of secrecy about his work. Evelyn hadn't interacted with him much since his abrupt departure from the lab months ago, but now his name was resurfacing in the most unsettling way. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that Victor might be involved. Evelyn realizes that Victor's emails contain encrypted codes. She cracked the encryption on one of Victor's files, uncovering a trail of correspondences. Within them were shipping logs for biohazard materials sent to an unregistered facility. The destination was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Dallas. The date on the logs coincided with Victor's departure, and Evelyn's stomach turned as she pieced together the clues. Someone had smuggled the modified bird flu out of the lab, and all evidence pointed to Victor. Meanwhile, the outbreak in Texas spreads, further worsening by the day. The outbreak, initially confined to small farming communities, had spread to urban areas. Hospitals are overwhelmed, and public health officials were scrambling to contain the panic. Doctors are left guessing at treatment options as more patients exhibit the same horrifying symptoms. The death toll climbed steadily, with new cases reported hundreds of miles away. News outlets began speculating about the possibility of a new pandemic, and rumors swirled that the virus was unlike any strain ever seen. Panic also sets in as local news channels report the mysterious deaths, though officials remain tight-lipped. Fear begins to ripple through the community. In a shocking twist, a local reporter investigating the outbreaks disappears under mysterious circumstances. Despite her growing suspicion, Evelyn knows she cannot raise the alarm without evidence. Her position at the research facility requires her to adhere to strict confidentiality agreements, and accusations without proof could ruin her career. But she cannot ignore the signs. The possibility that the virus was deliberately released, and worse, that someone from her lab was responsible, weighs heavily on her mind. Unbeknownst to Evelyn, her investigation will set her on a collision course with a conspiracy far darker and more dangerous than she could ever imagine. Evelyn's suspicions deepened when she noticed subtle patterns in the outbreaks. The affected areas were not random but seemed to align with transportation routes. It was as if the virus was being strategically spread. As she reviewed satellite imagery of the areas near the initial outbreak, Evelyn noticed something odd, a cluster of industrial buildings matching the location from Victor's shipping logs. She couldn't ignore the possibility that the warehouse could be the key to unraveling the mystery. At the same time, Evelyn began receiving anonymous emails. The messages were vague but threatening, warning her to stop investigating. She hadn't shared her suspicions with anyone, yet someone clearly knew what she was up to. The realization sent a chill down her spine. If she was right, this wasn't just about a rogue scientist, this was part of something much larger. Unable to keep her findings to herself and instead of backing down, Evelyn decided to reach out to someone outside the scientific community. She contacted Kate Lawson, an investigative journalist known for exposing corruption in powerful organizations. Kate had built her career on chasing dangerous leads, and Evelyn hoped she could help expose the truth. After a brief exchange, Kate agreed to dig into the leads Evelyn had uncovered. Kate's investigation quickly revealed more alarming connections. Victor had been working closely with Mutation, a pharmaceutical company with a questionable reputation and that had been stockpiling flu vaccines. The company, led by the enigmatic Harold Kane, was a wealthy and influential figure who had pushed for emergency government contracts, had recently secured massive government contracts to produce vaccines. Kane, a billionaire with powerful political connections, had long been suspected of using unethical methods to expand his empire. Kate uncovered evidence suggesting that Mutation had been preparing for a pandemic long before the outbreak began. As Evelyn and Kate pooled their findings, they began to see the outlines of a sinister plot. Victor's role wasn't merely that of a rogue scientist, he appeared to be a key player in a much larger conspiracy. But before they could act on their discoveries, Evelyn noticed something disturbing. Her home security system had been tampered with, and her research files were missing from her office. Someone was watching her every move. The realization hit hard. Whoever was behind this had resources and reach far beyond anything Evelyn had anticipated. She was no longer just an investigator, she was a target. As she and Kate delved deeper into the conspiracy, the danger escalated. Evelyn knew they were on the brink of uncovering something explosive, but the closer they got to the truth, the greater the risk became. Kate Lawson's investigation into Mutation Pharmaceuticals uncovered a labyrinth of hidden connections and questionable dealings. The company had been stockpiling flu vaccines months before the first reported outbreak in Texas, raising unsettling questions about their foreknowledge of the crisis. Digging through corporate filings and whistleblower accounts, Kate found evidence that Novagen CEO Harold Kane had been lobbying aggressively for pandemic preparedness contracts even when no imminent threat existed. This wasn't just opportunism, it felt like calculated planning. Meanwhile, Evelyn Hayes couldn't shake the dread that her suspicions about Victor Stein were correct. The encrypted files she had uncovered hinted at secret experiments far beyond the lab's approved research scope. As Kate continued to follow the paper trail, Evelyn focused on the scientific side, reanalyzing old data from the modified bird flu strain. Her worst fears were confirmed. The strain was nearly identical to the one now wreaking havoc across the country, but with one key difference: it had been engineered to spread more efficiently between humans. This wasn't an accident or a natural mutation, it was deliberate. As the outbreak spiraled out of control, reports of new cases came from neighboring states. News outlets described overcrowded hospitals, frantic doctors, and the eerie silence of quarantined neighborhoods. Panic spread faster than the virus, with grocery stores emptied and travel restrictions imposed. The government remained tight-lipped about the source of the virus, but behind closed doors, officials were scrambling to contain both the disease and the growing unrest. Evelyn and Kate's findings pointed to a grim conclusion. The outbreak wasn't a natural disaster, but an act of bio-terrorism. Victor's role became clearer as Kate unearthed records of private meetings between him and Novagen executives. One particularly damning document revealed a contract for consultation services signed just days after Victor left the lab. It appeared that Victor had sold the modified strain to Novagen, knowing it could be weaponized to trigger a pandemic. Further investigation led Kate to an abandoned warehouse outside Dallas, the same location referenced in Victor's shipping logs. The building was surrounded by rusting fences and appeared long forgotten, but inside, Kate discovered evidence of recent activity. Empty biohazard containers and traces of chemical residue suggested the warehouse had been used to store and possibly distribute the virus. A set of tire tracks leading away from the site hinted at hasty departures, but there was no sign of who had been there. Evelyn's fears intensified when Kate uncovered another chilling detail. Novagen had already received billions in government funding to produce a vaccine, despite the outbreak being in its early stages. Kane's company stood to gain even more as the crisis deepened. But there was a sinister twist: the vaccines being developed were based on the original strain and wouldn't work against the rapidly mutating virus. Kane and his associates had underestimated the pathogen's ability to evolve, creating a disaster they could no longer control. As Evelyn and Kate shared their findings, they realized they had enough evidence to expose Novagen. Leaked documents, shipping records, and scientific data painted a damning picture of corporate greed and scientific recklessness. But just as they prepared to go public, they hit a wall. Further investigation reveals that Novagen stood to make billions if a pandemic forced global governments to purchase their vaccines. Kate and Evelyn realize they are uncovering a conspiracy far larger than they imagined. The virus, it seems, was not an accident, it was a deliberate act of bioterrorism. Victor had released the modified bird flu to create demand for Novagen's vaccines, with Kane orchestrating the cover-up. But there's a catch: the virus is mutating faster than anyone expected, making the vaccines ineffective. Evelyn and Kate gather enough evidence to expose Novagen, including documents tying Victor and Kane to the outbreaks. But their plans are derailed when Victor Stein, the man at the center of it all, was found dead in a car crash. The circumstances were suspicious, with investigators blaming brake failure, but Evelyn and Kate saw it differently. Victor had been silenced, a convenient end to a man who knew too much. His death left a gaping hole in their case, but it also confirmed their fears. Someone was willing to kill to keep the truth hidden. The stakes grew higher with each passing day. Evelyn's movements were being tracked, and Kate began noticing unmarked cars parked outside her office. Both women knew they were being watched, but stopping now wasn't an option. They were on the brink of exposing one of the most horrifying conspiracies in modern history, but the forces working against them were growing stronger. The clock was ticking, and the virus continued its relentless march across the globe. Evelyn Hayes and Kate Lawson knew they were in a race against time. The virus, now labeled H7 mutant, was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. The death toll had reached staggering numbers, and new cases were reported daily, crossing state lines and international borders. Governments scrambled to impose travel restrictions by shutting down airports and other means of transportation and lockdowns, but the chaos was impossible to contain. Hospitals are overwhelmed, and governments are unable to contain the hysteria. Evelyn watched the news with a sinking feeling, knowing the virus had evolved beyond any control, mutating in ways even she hadn't predicted during her time at the lab. The world was teetering on the brink of a global pandemic, but for Evelyn and Kate, the stakes were personal. They had uncovered a conspiracy implicating Novagen Pharmaceuticals and Harold Cain, but their efforts to expose the truth were being thwarted at every turn. Victor Stein's death had been a calculated move to silence him and send a message to anyone else trying to dig too deeply. The evidence they had gathered was compelling, but without Victor, the chain of accountability was incomplete. Meanwhile, Novagen continued to dominate the headlines, portraying itself as humanity's savior. Cain held televised press conferences, promising a vaccine that would be distributed globally within weeks. Behind the scenes, however, Evelyn knew the truth. The vaccines were based on outdated research, designed for the original strain of the virus. The rapid mutations of H7 mutant the vaccines almost useless. Cain's promises weren't just empty, they were dangerous. Governments were pouring billions into Novagen, banking on a solution that didn't exist. Kate's investigation into Cain's dealings uncovered another shocking layer to the conspiracy. Financial records showed that Cain had shorted stocks in companies likely to collapse during a pandemic, betting on the economic devastation his virus would cause. He wasn't just profiting from the vaccine, he was exploiting the chaos he had unleashed. Cain had built his empire on greed, but his hubris had blinded him to the uncontrollable nature of the virus. As Evelyn and Kate prepared to leak their findings to the press, they faced mounting threats. Kate's office was broken into, her files ransacked, and her sources silenced. Evelyn's home was vandalized, a clear warning to back off. But the threats only strengthened their resolve. They reached out to independent journalists and smaller media outlets, knowing the mainstream press was too easily influenced by corporate money. The first article exposing Novagen's involvement was published online, quickly gaining traction. The fallout was immediate. Protests erupted outside Novagen's headquarters, demanding transparency and accountability. Cain's PR team worked overtime to discredit the claims, painting Evelyn as a disgruntled former employee and Kate as a conspiracy theorist. But the evidence spoke for itself, and public sentiment began to turn. Desperation drove Cain to make mistakes. In an effort to protect himself, he ordered the destruction of incriminating documents at Novagen's labs, but the act was caught on camera by an undercover reporter. The footage went viral, sparking outrage and drawing the attention of federal investigators. Cain's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. But just as Evelyn and Kate felt they were gaining ground, the outbreak reached a tipping point. The virus had reached catastrophic levels, now suspected to have spread through global trade routes, devastating major cities in Europe and Asia. Hospitals were overrun, and entire cities were placed under quarantine. Governments were paralyzed by indecision, and social order was breaking down. Fear turned to panic as food supplies dwindled, and public services collapsed under the strain. In the midst of this chaos, Evelyn Hayes and Kate Lawson were running out of time. Their efforts to expose Novagen Pharmaceuticals had drawn attention to the company, but it wasn't enough to stop Harold Cain. The CEO was still orchestrating his escape, while the world burned from the very pandemic he had helped create. Evelyn realized the virus was mutating faster than she'd thought possible. With every new host, it adapted, becoming more lethal and harder to treat. She tried to warn public health officials, but her calls were ignored. Her association with the Novagen scandal had tarnished her credibility, and the scientific community was reluctant to listen. Kate, meanwhile, faced her own challenges. She received anonymous tips about Cain's movements, suggesting he was preparing to flee the country. Following the lead, Kate's investigation into Cain's private jet proved fruitful. She uncovered a private jet registered under a shell corporation linked to Novagen, scheduled to depart for a remote Caribbean island. She confirmed that Cain planned to leave the country under a false identity. Using a hidden airstrip outside Houston, the flight was set to take him to an isolated Caribbean island where he had purchased a fortified estate. Cain wasn't just running, he was escaping with millions of dollars in offshore accounts, leaving the world to deal with the chaos he had orchestrated. It was clear Kane had no intention of facing the consequences of his actions. Kate worked quickly to leak the details of his escape plan to trusted journalists, hoping to spark public outrage and pressure authorities into intervening. The world was descending into chaos, and Evelyn and Kate knew that their fight wasn't just against Kane or Novagen. It was against an entire system built on greed and corruption, a system that had allowed this disaster to happen. And as they pushed forward, they realized they might not survive long enough to see justice served. As Kate prepared to expose Kane's escape plan, Evelyn worked frantically on the virus itself to compile her findings into a comprehensive report. She hoped that if the public understood the true nature of H7 mutant, they could pressure governments to take meaningful action. But time was running out. Her analysis revealed something even more terrifying. The strain's mutations were accelerating, and it was on the brink of becoming airborne. If that happened, containment would be impossible. The death toll, already in the millions, would rise exponentially. The virus was spreading faster than they could fight it, and the forces working against them were more ruthless than ever. Evelyn knew that exposing Novagen wasn't enough. She had to find a way to halt the virus's spread, or humanity itself could face extinction. Evelyn discovered a potential weakness in the virus. During the lab experiments, she had noted that the strain was highly sensitive to a specific antiviral compound. This compound had never been tested on humans, as it was deemed too unstable for widespread use. But desperate times called for desperate measures. If she could synthesize the compound and distribute it, there was a chance it could slow the virus long enough for scientists worldwide to develop a more effective treatment. However, the formula was locked within the same Novagen archives that Kane was now actively destroying. Kate worked to infiltrate Novagen's headquarters while Evelyn directed her to the files she needed. With the building under heavy security due to the protests, Kate had to act quickly. Using a contact inside the company, she gained access to the server room just as workers were purging the data. Kate managed to retrieve the formula and escape, but not without a close call. Novagen's security team spotted her, and she narrowly avoided capture by blending into the crowd of protesters outside. Evelyn wasted no time analyzing the data Kate had recovered. She confirmed that the compound could be synthesized, but the process required specialized equipment and resources. Knowing she couldn't trust traditional channels, Evelyn reached out to independent labs willing to operate outside the government's jurisdiction. These labs, though small, were run by scientists equally desperate to find a solution. Together, they began producing small batches of the antiviral compound. As word of the compound spread, the tide began to turn. Hospitals started using the treatment on critically ill patients, and while it wasn't a cure, it significantly slowed the virus's progression. The death rate began to drop, giving the world a glimmer of hope. Evelyn and Kate's efforts were finally making a difference, but their fight was far from over. Harold Kane's escape plan unraveled when the leaked information went public. Protesters flooded the airstrip, where his jet was stationed, preventing it from taking off. Authorities, under immense pressure, were forced to act. Kane was arrested on charges of conspiracy, bio-terrorism, and manslaughter. His empire crumbled as more evidence of his involvement in the pandemic surfaced. But for Evelyn and Kate, his capture was only a small victory. The virus was still out there, and the world was forever changed. In the aftermath, Evelyn became a leading voice in global health reform, advocating for stricter regulations on bioengineering and corporate accountability. Kate's investigative work earned her international recognition, but she remained haunted by the lives lost. Together, they had uncovered a conspiracy that nearly destroyed humanity, but their victory came at a great cost. Evelyn, hailed as a hero, testifies against Novagen, revealing the depths of their corruption. However, she lives in constant fear, knowing the shadowy forces behind bio-warfare are still out there. Kate publishes a best-selling book exposing the conspiracy, but she, too, remains haunted by the lives lost. As the world began to rebuild, the memory of the outbreak lingered. The pandemic had exposed the fragility of human systems and the devastating consequences of greed. For Evelyn and Kate, their mission wasn't over. They had seen firsthand what could happen when power went unchecked, and they were determined to ensure that nothing like this would ever happen again. Yet, as they reflected on everything they had uncovered, a nagging question remained: was Kane acting alone, Or were there others still hiding in the shadows, waiting for their chance to unleash the next disaster? The thought was as chilling as the virus itself, leaving an unsettling sense that this story was far from over. In the end, the outbreak subsides, but the world is forever changed. Stricter regulations on bio-research are implemented, but the scars of feathered plague remain a chilling reminder of humanity's darkest capabilities. Thank you for joining us on Mystery Minds. The story of the feathered plague is a haunting reminder of how human ambition can turn deadly. If you enjoyed this case, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more chilling stories that uncover the darkest truths of our world. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and until next time, this is Mystery Minds.